I had lived with my father for as long as I could remember. My mother died when I was very young. I had barely turned 4. Her face had long faded from my memory, leaving only blurred shadows in old photo albums and fragmented stories my father sometimes retold with sadness. The house we lived in belonged to my grandparents, a spacious home with high ceilings, creaky staircases, and the scent of wood absorbed into its walls. After my mother's death, her parents seemed to dissolve in their grief. They didn't try to maintain a close relationship with us, and even when they met with my father, they seemed distant, as if their world had shrunk to the photographs on the shelf and memories of their daughter. It had always been just my father and me, and that seemed to be enough. Of course, by the time I turned 12, he started seeing women. A few fleeting romances, coffee dates, occasional dinners at restaurants while I stayed with a nanny. But none of them stayed in his life long enough to become part of our family. No one ever came to our home. My father never seemed particularly eager or made any serious plans, as if he himself didn't believe he could find someone who would fill the emptiness left by my mother. But everything changed when I turned 14. By then, my grandparents had also passed away, and now it was just my father and me in that big, slightly worn house. I had grown used to the quiet, to his calm presence in the evenings, to the soft glow of the desk lamp in his study, and the gentle rustling of newspapers he liked to read before bed. And then he met Ursula. "Kaladra, my dear. I want you to meet someone special," he said one evening, and I knew right away that something had changed. His voice was slightly tense, his smile uncertain, as if he wasn't yet used to saying those words. I stepped out of my room and saw them in the living room. Ursula was a tall, elegant woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, manicured nails, and a flawlessly tailored dress. But what caught my attention were the 2 teenagers standing behind her. "These are my children," Ursula said with a practiced smile. "Alberto is in his first year of college, and this is Rosella. She's 16. Alberto barely glanced at me, too absorbed in his phone, where new messages kept flashing. But Rosella. She looked me straight in the eye, and later that evening, she cornered me in the kitchen. "Listen," she said, crossing her arms. "Let's get one thing straight. We are not sisters. And we won't be friends either. Just stay out of my way, and we'll be fine." I nodded silently. Not because I was scared, just. I had no intention of becoming her friend anyway. Everything happened faster than I expected. 6 months later, my father and Ursula got married. She and her children moved into our house, and suddenly, the familiar walls that once felt so spacious started closing in. Alberto took the guest room. Rosella was given the study, which was converted into a bedroom. And Ursula's belongings appeared everywhere, as if they had multiplied overnight, filling every available corner. The hardest part was the bathroom situation. Ursula could spend hours in there, tending to her beauty routine, while Rosella held endless selfie sessions. I had to start waking up an hour earlier just to take a shower before school. But I didn't complain. Not when I saw the way my father's face lit up when Ursula entered the room. Not when he started humming to himself while making breakfast. Not when, for the first time in years, he began leaving work on time to have dinner with us. He was happy. Truly happy. But everything changed again when my father got a promotion. One evening, he came home beaming, his tie loosened, his smile wide. "Regional Sales Director," he announced at dinner. Can you believe it? Ursula immediately started talking about buying a new car, renovating the kitchen. But I fixated on something else, his mention of frequent business trips. It meant he'd be away for weeks. Sometimes even months. The first time he left on a trip, Ursula's demeanor shifted instantly. As soon as his car disappeared through the gates, she turned to me with an expression I had never seen before. "Kaladra," she said coldly. "We need to establish some ground rules." I straightened up, waiting for her to continue. Those ground rules turned out to be a long list of tasks and restrictions. I had to be home by 4:30 p.m. No exceptions, not even for school events or study groups. But I have volleyball practice on Thursdays. I protested. Then you'll have to quit the team, Ursula replied without so much as blinking. Then she added, "You'll be helping with dinner and housework. Starting today." The first few days were rough. I would literally run home from school, barely catching my breath before Ursula started barking orders. "Have you mopped the floors, Kaladra? These windows are filthy, Kaladra. Start chopping the vegetables for dinner, Kaladra." Every day, she found something urgent that needed to be done, and every day, I followed her commands without protest. Meanwhile, Rosella lounged on the couch, stretching out her legs, phone in hand. She giggled carelessly at whatever her latest boyfriend had texted her, seemingly oblivious to my frantic scurrying around the house. Alberto was rarely around. He was either at a friend's place or out somewhere, but if he happened to be home, he would leave his dirty dishes in the sink without a second thought. Laundry, too, was something he clearly considered someone else's responsibility. One evening, as I was scrubbing pots and Rosella had TikTok blasting at full volume, I finally snapped. Why doesn't Rosella have to help with any of this? Ursula, sitting at the table with a magazine in hand, lazily lifted her gaze to me. Rosella needs to focus on preparing for college. She can't waste time on housework. I looked over at Rosella. She was standing in front of the mirror, recording the latest dance trend, something that was clearly far from educational. "But she's just," I started, then stopped. There was that dangerous edge in Ursula's voice, the one that meant, "Keep arguing, and you'll regret it." I went back to washing dishes. Pointless. But the worst part wasn't even the endless chores or the blatant unfairness of it all. The worst part was how Ursula transformed the moment my father returned from a business trip or even just called. The second he stepped through the door, she instantly became the exhausted yet heroically enduring woman. She would sigh dramatically, sink into a chair, press a hand to her forehead, and murmur, "Oh, darling, you have no idea how hard it's been. Managing the house alone, taking care of everything." And my father, sweet, naive father, would kiss her forehead and immediately pull out another gift he had bought on his trip, a designer handbag, expensive perfume, a necklace that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe combined. "You're incredible," he'd tell her with admiration. "I don't know what we would do without you." I stood off to the side, hands still damp from cleaning, homework untouched, watching as she effortlessly soaked in his praise, basking in his adoration. Sometimes, I'd catch Rosella smirking at me over the top of her phone. And I kept my mouth shut. What was the point of saying anything? My father was happy. Successful. In love. The years dragged on, thick and slow like syrup. Before I knew it, I was in my final year of high school. Alberto had graduated from college 2 years ago but still lived at home. He claimed he was waiting for the right opportunity, but in reality, that meant sitting in his room playing video games and occasionally going on job interviews that, somehow, never led anywhere. Rosella was in her 3rd year at the local college. She, too, stayed home, maintaining her monopoly on the bathroom and her unshakable refusal to lift a finger around the house. My 18th birthday came in early spring. I wasn't expecting much. A few weeks before, Ursula had already made it clear there would be no grand celebration. "We'll just have a small family dinner," she said, not even looking up from her phone. "No need to waste money on a big party." I tried not to think about what Rosella's 18th birthday had been like. 2 years ago, Ursula had rented a hall, hired a professional DJ, booked catering. Nearly 100 guests enjoyed a party she had spent weeks planning. Everything had to be perfect. But for me, a simple family dinner. At least my father was home. That in itself was rare. But the next morning, he was leaving for another business trip. "Sorry, princess," my father said, hugging me before he left. "We'll celebrate properly when I get back." I nodded, pressing against him, inhaling the familiar scent of his cologne. And then he was gone. And the house became cold and suffocating again. I focused on preparing for graduation. Finishing up college applications, ordering my cap and gown, the usual senior year things. Everything seemed to be going as expected, until one dinner changed everything. It had been about a week since my father left. We were sitting at the table, me, Orsola, Alberto, and Rosella. I lazily pushed peas around my plate, trying to ignore Rosella's endless rambling about the latest drama with her boyfriend. At some point, Orsola cleared her throat. "Caladra," she said, folding her hands on the table. "We need to have a serious talk." I perked up. Maybe she wanted to discuss my college plans? I had avoided that topic with her, but perhaps she was finally showing some interest in my future. "Now that you're 18, she continued, her voice sickeningly sweet. "You're legally an adult, and adults have responsibilities. Starting next month, you'll need to pay rent. $500 a month." She smiled. "Seems fair, doesn't it?" I literally choked on my food. Alberto, sitting next to me, patted my back, grinning. I looked around. Alberto and Rosella were watching me with undisguised amusement, as if this was some kind of entertaining show. "And what happens if I can't pay?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. Orsola's smile widened, but something hard flickered in her eyes. "Then you'll have to find somewhere else to live, won't you? We can't afford to support freeloaders." I sat there, staring at her as her words rang in my ears. The unfairness of it all was staggering. All these years, I had been forced to work around the house like a servant while her children did nothing. And now they were trying to push me out altogether. Something inside me snapped. I lifted my gaze, my voice surprisingly calm. "Let's clarify something." I turned to Alberto. He graduated from college 2 years ago and spends his days playing video games, but he doesn't pay rent? Then to Rosella. She's in her 3rd year, has never washed a single dish in her life, but she doesn't pay either. And then back to Orsola. "But I have to." Orsola dabbed her mouth with a napkin, keeping her expression composed. "I've decided that my children won't have to pay rent until they're settled." Something inside me finally surfaced. I felt a smile form on my lips. But not the one I had worn all these years, not polite, not restrained. This smile made Orsola tense, just slightly. "Interesting," I murmured, leaning back in my chair. "But here's the thing. I won't be paying rent." A heavy silence fell over the table. Alberto scoffed, then laughed. Rosella followed. Orsola let out a short, sharp chuckle, but it sounded more forced than usual. "What are you talking about?" she asked, tension creeping into her voice. I met her gaze. "This house belongs to me." The laughter at the table stopped. Orsola's face flickered through a series of emotions: amusement, confusion, disbelief, and then something close to panic. "That's ridiculous," she muttered, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling your father." Her manicured nails tapped feverishly against the screen. She put the call on speaker. One ring, then another, and then my father's voice filled the room. "Hey." I heard Orsola take a deep breath before speaking. "David, Caladra is telling some rather interesting stories here. About the house, which she claims belongs to her." "That's not true, is it?" The silence on the other end of the line lasted what felt like an eternity. My father's voice lifted slightly, and I could picture him nervously clearing his throat. "Actually," He began. My parents put the house in Kaladra's name before they passed away. I didn't think that you needed to know. Ursula practically shrieked. How could you not tell me? I didn't think it was important, my father muttered, clearly thrown off. Not important? Ursula looked like she was about to explode. Your teenage daughter owns our house, and you didn't think that was worth mentioning? She hung up before my father could reply, slamming the phone down so hard she nearly sent it flying across the table. Tense silence filled the kitchen, broken only by the steady hum of the refrigerator. Alberto and Rosella stared at me as if they were seeing me for the first time. Ursula took several deep breaths, trying to steady herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was deliberately light, but I could hear the slight tremor underneath. Well, she forced out, adding a strained chuckle that sounded more like a hiccup, this is clearly some sort of misunderstanding. Of course, you don't need to pay rent, Kaladra. Let's just forget this conversation ever happened. I had completely lost my appetite. Without a word, I stood up and left the kitchen, heading for the stairs. As I climbed to the second floor, hushed, frantic whispers drifted up from below. I could make out Ursula's voice, sharp, tense phrases mixing with Alberto and Rosella's irritated murmurs. By 6 a.m, I was already awake, staring at the ceiling. The events of the previous night played over and over in my mind. Everything had changed in just a few hours. Around 7, I heard movement downstairs. A familiar sound, Ursula making her morning coffee. I was about to head down for breakfast when I caught the sound of her voice. She was on the phone. Her tone was low, but tense. Davide, you need to do something about this situation, she hissed. Your daughter can't just. We need to get her out. I froze on the stairs, holding my breath. I know it's her house, Ursula continued, her voice laced with frustration, masked by artificial sweetness. But she's making things difficult. She doesn't fit here anymore. She's becoming a problem. Silence. Even from here, I could hear the hesitation in my father's voice. Ursula. It's her house. I can't just kick her out. No one is saying you should kick her out. Ursula's voice took on that sickly sweet tone she used when manipulating someone. We just need to steer her in the right direction. She paused, letting the words sink in. For example, the colleges she applied to. They're all out of state. Why don't you convince her to go to one of them? Tell her it'll be good for her independence. I felt my stomach twist into a painful knot. Another pause. Then I heard my father sigh heavily. Maybe you're right, he said. I'll talk to her about moving away. It might be better for everyone. A crushing weight pressed against my chest. I waited until Ursula ended the call before moving downstairs. The kitchen was filled with the usual morning routine. I poured myself a bowl of cereal, keeping my expression as neutral as possible. A few minutes later, Alberto and Rosella walked in. They looked groggy and irritated, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. Ursula entered last, still gripping her phone. Good morning, everyone. She chirped, as if last night had never happened. I lifted my spoon and slowly started eating, watching her carefully. We sat at the table, the only sounds the crunch of cereal and the occasional clink of spoons against bowls. And then, as casually as if I were commenting on the weather, I said, by the way, starting next month, you'll all have to pay rent. Ursula's toast froze halfway to her mouth, Alberto dropped his phone straight into his bowl of cereal, and Rosella's spoon fell onto her plate with a dull clatter. Excuse me, Ursula's voice was barely audible. Rent, I repeated, calmly taking another spoonful of cereal. I think $500 per person sounds fair. That's what adults do, right? They pay for their own living expenses. Ursula's face went pale, then quickly flushed with splotches of red. She coughed, clearly having inhaled her coffee the wrong way. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm very serious. But we're family, Ursula stammered, her composure visibly cracking. Family doesn't charge each other rent, that's not how it works. Weren't you just yesterday insisting that I should pay rent? I asked, absent-mindedly stirring my cereal. Ursula's cheeks burned. She set her coffee cup down with such force that liquid sloshed over the rim. That was different. She burst out. I was trying to teach you financial responsibility. To prepare you for the real world. I couldn't help but laugh. Financial responsibility? The real world? That's especially rich coming from someone who's been living in someone else's house for 4 years without paying a cent. Listen here, Alberto started, but I cut him off. No, you listen. You graduated college 2 years ago. You don't have a job. You spend your entire day playing video games and eating food I help pay for with my part-time job. Maybe it's time for you to learn a little something about financial responsibility, too? I turned to Rosella. And you? When was the last time you washed your own clothes? Rosella narrowed her eyes but said nothing. How dare you? Ursula shot up from her chair, her voice rising into a shriek. After everything I've done for this family. I tilted my head, as if considering. What exactly have you done? I asked, genuinely curious. Force me to do all the housework while your kids did nothing? Tried to charge me rent for my own house? Or maybe you're talking about how you spent this morning convincing my dad to get rid of me? Ursula's eyes widened. You were eavesdropping? I heard everything, I said calmly, pushing my bowl away. Her face turned an alarming shade of red. You're just a spiteful, cruel child. She spat. You're jealous of my kids. Jealous? I let out a short laugh. If I were jealous, I'd be lying on the couch all day, living off someone else's dime. Rosella scoffed. Oh, so what now? You're kicking us out? You ungrateful little parasite. Alberto exploded, jumping up so fast that his chair crashed backward. I remained seated. This is my house, I said evenly. My grandparents' house. You're the ones who moved in, remember? Ursula's lips pressed into a thin line. You'll regret this, she hissed, pushing away from the table. You have no idea what you're doing. Then she spun toward Alberto and Rosella. Pack your things. We're leaving. I silently watched as they stormed upstairs. Angry footsteps, slamming doors, frustrated muttering echoed from above. An hour later, burdened with a few hastily packed bags, they came back down. Ursula didn't even bother closing the door behind her. She just stormed out toward the car, Alberto and Rosella trailing behind, their luggage clattering against the steps. I remained at the kitchen table, finishing my now soggy cereal. The house felt strange in its newfound silence. I wandered from room to room, adjusting the things they had left behind in their rush. A few coffee mugs on the kitchen table, forgotten books in the living room, a couple of crumpled shirts draped over the back of a chair. As if all of it was proof that, yes, they had been here. But now they were gone. I tried to process everything that had happened. It wasn't until midday that my phone rang. My father's name lit up on the screen. I took a deep breath before answering. Hello. What the hell are you doing? His voice exploded through the speaker. I immediately pulled the phone away from my ear. Ursula just called me in hysterics. He went on. How could you be so cruel? Something inside me broke. Years of trying to keep the peace, staying silent, being the good daughter. I was done. Cruel. I cut him off mid-rant. That's interesting, Dad. Where was all this concern for cruelty when your wife was trying to charge me rent to live in my own house? You think that was kind? Silence. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower. Uncertain. What are you talking about? Ursula would never. Don't you dare pretend you didn't know. My voice shook. I heard your phone call this morning, Dad. When she tried to convince you to make me move out. And you agreed. Do you remember that conversation? Silence again. I could almost see him shifting uncomfortably, the way he always did when he got caught in a lie. Kaladra, sweetheart. You don't understand, he started, but then he pulled himself together, his voice turning sharp again. You're tearing this family apart, Kaladra. Is that what you want? I slowly sat down on the couch. The same couch Rosella had lounged on for hours while I did all the housework. Ursula is threatening to divorce me over this, he continued, his voice unsteady. She says she'll leave if you don't apologize. I looked up at the walls of the living room. The pictures hanging there were mostly of Ursula's family, her kids, her distant relatives, her friends. There was only one picture of my mother. Small. Tucked into a corner. I looked at it, and something inside me finally clicked into place. I'm not apologizing, Dad, I said, my voice steady. The line went dead. He had hung up. Graduation came and went in a blur. The ceremony was beautiful, but the empty seats where my family should have been felt like a weight pressing on my chest. My best friend Sarah's parents took pictures of us together and invited me to dinner. They didn't mention my family's absence. But their hugs lasted just a little longer than usual. I spent the next few days going through college acceptance letters, trying to decide what to do next. The house felt both empty and peaceful. Until that day. A familiar car pulled into the driveway. My father stepped out first. Then Ursula. Alberto. Rosella. The three of them stood behind him like a delegation at an important meeting. Dressed carefully, their expressions equally stern. I met them at the door before they even had a chance to knock. Kaladra, my father said in an official tone. Ursula stood right behind his shoulder, nodding encouragingly, like a puppeteer pulling the strings. We're here to resolve the situation. I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe, waiting silently. I'm willing to forgive your recent behavior, he continued, choosing his words carefully. We can all move back in, and things can go back to the way they were. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. But you need to apologize to Ursula and her children for how you treated them, he added. And, of course, drop this ridiculous idea about rent. I looked at their faces. My father's strained smile. The smug expressions on Alberto and Rosella's faces. The same smirks I had seen on them for years as they carelessly enjoyed the comfort of a home where I had been nothing more than convenient labor. Flashes of memories ran through my mind, countless nights spent washing dishes while they watched movies, cleaning up while they giggled at the table, wrapped up in their own trivial problems. I remembered watching my father slowly turn into someone I barely recognized. No. No, I simply said. My father's face twisted. Then you leave me no choice, his voice turned sharp, almost threatening. If you refuse to be reasonable, if you don't want to be part of this family, then I'm done. He held my gaze, as if expecting me to change my mind. I'm leaving, Kaladra. And I'm disowning you. That's your choice, Dad, I replied evenly. He blinked. You made it clear who you chose, your wife and her children over your own daughter. Just like you have for years. Ursula let out a dramatic gasp, as if I had just struck her. How dare you? She shrieked. You ungrateful little witch. You've always been jealous of my children. Always tried to come between us and your father. Slowly, I pulled out my phone. One more word, I said, looking directly at her, and I'm calling the police for harassment. Your choice. The silence that followed was deafening. The threat of police involvement shut her up faster than anything else ever could. My father averted his gaze and gave a slow nod. Then, without another word, he turned and walked into the house to gather the few belongings he had left behind after moving out. No one spoke. Not when he packed his things into boxes. Not when he carried them to the car. Not when he took one last walk through the house where he had raised me. When he was done, he simply walked out. He didn't say goodbye. None of them did. They just got in the car and drove away. The only thing they left behind were tire tracks in the driveway. It's been 3 months since then. I'm writing this from my dorm room at Northwestern University, more than 1,000 miles from home. The house is now managed by a rental agency, and they found a lovely family to move in, a young couple with 2 little girls. The rent covers my college expenses entirely. I can focus on my studies without worrying about money. Sometimes, I hear about my father through mutual acquaintances. He's renting a 3-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. Still working the same job, still holding on to the fancy title and the comfortable salary. Ursula finally got that home renovation she always dreamed of. New granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, just not in her own home, but in someone else's. Alberto found a job. Though, from what I hear, he still lives with my father. Rosella dropped out of college. But at least she has a fashion blog now. They live their lives. And I live mine. Sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, I look at old photographs. Pictures from when my mother was alive. When my father's smile reached his eyes. When family meant something different. I wonder if he regrets his choices now. If he ever thinks about me. If he misses me the way I miss him. Maybe one day, he'll realize what he lost. Maybe one day, we'll find a way to mend what's broken. Or maybe we won't. But I do know one thing, I'm stronger now than I ever thought I could be. Leave a comment with your thoughts on this story, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. See you soon.